is Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, or the joy of love. In the very first paragraph, the Holy Father reminds us that the Christian proclamation on the family is good news indeed. With all my heart, I agree. My personal experience as a daughter and a sister and wife and mother convinces me of the beauty and truth of the Church's teaching on marriage and the family. It's a light that should be put on a lampstand, yet often it seems that this light is hidden under a bushel. My sense is that many of us have been so browbeaten by the prevailing culture around us that we're almost ashamed to hold up the Christian view and the Church's vision of marriage and the family as an ideal, lest we might be condemned as unrealistic or of seeking to offend those whose circumstances don't conform to it. But that would be both a mistake and a tragedy. More than ever, we need things that are good and beautiful and true to aspire to. And again, from my own experience, I can say without reservation that there's nothing unrealistic about trying to live in one's marriage and in family in line with the Church's teaching. I don't say I always achieve it, and I'm quite sure that those who are closest to me are even more acutely aware than I am of the many ways in which I fail, but I do say that I try, and there is joy in the attempt. So my objective this morning is to consider three things. First, I want to reflect on love as the central theme of family life. In particular, I want to consider what love means in a Catholic marriage and family, and how this may differ from love as it's commonly understood in today's culture. I want to draw attention to the delightful paradox of freedom that is to be found in binding oneself to another, and how this highlights the nature of love as a duty. Secondly, I'll speak about what to me is one of the most important aspects of family, which makes it peculiarly suited to be the training ground for civility, namely that, in large measure, we don't choose our own family. And thirdly, I want to offer you my thoughts about the most immediate and dreadful threat to the family in our country, in which choice is wrongly elevated over virtue. Mothers and children are made into adversaries, and death is preferred to life. This, of course, is the movement to repeal the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution. And let me say at once that I sincerely hope that the World Meeting of Families will address this most grievous attack on family life. When the world today speaks of love, what does it mean? For many, the first and possibly the last thought will be of being in love, romantic love, that is, our understanding of which frequently owes more to Hollywood than to Rome. It connotes candlelight and moonlight, pulse-quickening excitement, the first flush of infatuation. In short, it's about feelings, emotions. Love as an emotional condition is, however, a fragile and a fickle thing. How often do we hear it said that we can't help who we fall in love with, as though it were like catching a cold? Or that a husband has simply fallen out of love with his wife, and having fallen in love with someone else, that would be a form of self-betrayal for him not to leave the first for the second. I recently I was in the car driving and heard 24 Hours from Tulsa by Gene Pitney. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but the last line of it is, "I hate to do this to you, but I love somebody new. What can I do?" And that very much sums up the idea of love as an emotion, something that can't be helped. And when love is dependent on how one feels, this seems perfectly reasonable. And by contrast, the Church's tiresome insistence on permanence of marriage seems unreasonable. When my husband and I were preparing for marriage, he was troubled with the question of how anyone could promise to love anyone else for a lifetime. To promise always to feel a particular way is a difficult thing to do. Obviously, he always feels that he loves me. But if you're the sort of person who takes promises seriously, that idea of promising always to feel a certain way, is difficult. And during our marriage preparation, it came as a revelation to him that love is not a feeling. Love is a decision. It's an act of will. This is a profound truth, the importance of which has been all but lost in the dominant culture around us. What does it mean? Well, we can begin by reminding ourselves of Jesus' command that we must love our enemies. Now, God doesn't demand the impossible. The command can't mean that we must experience warm and fuzzy feelings of affection towards those who hate us. None of us could hope to achieve this. And to a very great extent, we're not responsible for our immediate emotional response to people or events. What we are, however, responsible for is what we do with that emotional response. Do we, for example, brood over insults or indulge feelings of enmity? There is a moral quality to such actions. The commandment to love our enemies is not that we should feel loving towards our enemies. It's that we should act as though we do. When the priest who prepared us for marriage described love as a decision, this is what he was getting at. In marriage, a husband and a wife promise to love each other. That doesn't mean that they promise never to be irked by the fact that one may leave the laundry beside rather than in the laundry basket, or that the other loads the dishwasher as an exercise in chaos theory. Such things happen. What it means is that even when the spouses may not feel all that loving towards each other, they continue to act loving. This is not a form of faking it till you make it. Not at all. Because the faking it is not faking it. It is the real thing. It's precisely in circumstances when you don't feel loving that the promise to love is most important. Love, then, is no mere tender feeling. It has something of the hard edge of duty about it. And duty is a very unfashionable word these days. Perhaps this is because it carries with it the connotation of having to do something that we don't want to do. And the precept that, we ought to be able to do what we want, whenever we like, is now akin to an article of faith for many. But make no mistake about it, marriage in the Catholic Church involves the duty to love. Indeed, when in a playful mood, which occurs only rarely because he is a lawyer, my husband may respond to my question, "Why do you love me?" with the answer and a twinkle in his eye, "Because the laws of the church require me to." This may sound a bit restrictive, oppressive even, but the truth is otherwise. It is in binding ourselves to one another that we achieve real freedom. The duty to love in the context of marriage is what gives rise to the extraordinary freedom that marriage can bring. In marriage, each spouse promises to give himself or herself to the other, without reservation or restriction, in a permanent and indissoluble union. It is this commitment that provides the security and space in which each spouse has the freedom to reveal to the other who he or she really is. We don't disclose this to other people. We all present a public face to the world, usually emphasizing our strengths and downplaying our weaknesses. And this is sensible, because in conditional relationships, we'd be unwise to reveal too much of ourselves, lest we disclose something that would bring the relationship to an end. It's only in an unconditional and permanent relationship that we can truly be ourselves. This is the form of relationship that allows for the full mutual flourishing of two people. It's a form of freedom much deeper than the superficial freedom to flit from one person to the next in search of elusive and transient feelings of love. It is where peace and joy are found. I have seen the beauty and power of this understanding of love in the shared lives of many couples, particularly older couples, who remain affectionate and interested in one another, who have retained and deepened their intimacy, and who can look back with satisfaction on decades of shared history and forward with hope for the years to come. The importance of such marriages in inspiring the young, who want so desperately to be inspired, is incalculable. These couples are living witnesses to the possibility of lifelong marriage. What this means is that it is in embracing duty, the duty to love, regardless of how we feel, that we have the best chance of experiencing joy. Duty, therefore, is not a bloodless and cold thing, but vital and warm. So to say that love is or should be at the centre of every family is no mere platitude. It is a challenge and an obligation. One of the most valuable features of family, I think, is that we don't choose it. While it's true to say that we can choose our spouses, we don't get to choose our parents. We can't choose our brothers and sisters. We can't choose our children. So we find ourselves thrown into close quarters with a group of people whom we might never have chosen to live with had that choice been available to us in the first place. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a good thing. That is God's genius. The family is the domestic church and a microcosm of society and the world outside. If we had the ability to choose our families, and there is an ever-increasing movement to make this so, we could avoid having to have conversations with those with whom we disagree. We could avoid compromise. We could avoid biting our lip, holding our tongue, turning the other cheek, because of course we would only mix with those we liked and found agreeable and who liked us. It's the very act of having to deal with those who are disagreeable, being tied to them by the bonds of blood and family, that really prepares us for life. If we let it, it makes us better people. In cities, in urban environments, and to an even greater extent in the virtual world of the internet, we are able to choose precisely with whom we associate. We're able to screen out those whose views we dislike or disagree with or merely find challenging. We choose our community. And what's often found is that the members of that community will tend to be people very like us. This is not a new phenomenon, but it has been magnified in recent years with the development of online social media. It is, I think, worrying. In Ireland, we've seen in stark relief some of the adverse consequences that can follow when people find themselves in what has been referred to as an ideological echo chamber. The Nyberg report into the collapse of the Irish banking system commented adversely on the fact that the Irish political establishment was composed almost entirely of people who agreed with each other. The danger of surrounding oneself with people with whom one agrees is that all dissent is filtered out and therefore doesn't have to be considered. By contrast, in a family, we very often find ourselves confronted by loud and often very insistent dissenting voices. And greatly to our benefit, These are voices that cannot be blocked or filtered out or ignored, because we simply have to put up with these people and live with them day to day, week to week. Family members may be trying, they may vex us, they may infuriate us, but they're very difficult to ignore. And in this respect, the family is like G.K. Chesterton's description of the village. Back in 1905, he wrote, "It's not fashionable to say much nowadays of the advantages of the small community. We're told that we must go in for large empires and large ideas. There is one advantage, however, in the small state, the city or the village, which only the willfully blind can overlook. The man who lives in a small community lives in a much larger world. He knows much more of the fierce varieties and uncompromising divergences of men. The reason is obvious. In a large community, we can choose our companions. In a small community, our companions are chosen for us." He goes on to say, "We make our friends, we make our enemies, but God chooses our next door neighbour. That is why the old religions and the old scriptural language showed so sharp a wisdom when they spoke not of one's duty towards humanity, but one's duty towards one's neighbour. The duty towards humanity may often take the form of some choice which is personal or even pleasurable. That duty may be a hobby, it may even be a dissipation. But we have to love our neighbour because he is there. A much more alarming reason for a much more serious operation. He is the sample of humanity which is actually given to us. Precisely because he may be anybody, he is everybody." Chesterton's point is that the freedom to choose one's companions insulates a person from the necessity to take account of and get along with those with whom you disagree on the most profound level. The village, he thought, meant that the inhabitant was compelled to face up to these differences, because in a village, you don't have the luxury of choice. So it is in a family. One of the critical lessons for what used to be called civility is that of listening to those with whom you disagree, not merely for the purpose of waiting one's turn to strike a rhetorical counterblow, but actually for the purpose of trying to understand why someone else thinks the way he or she does, without necessarily imputing malice to that person. That sort of lesson is often learned best in the family, along with lessons about kindness, manners, waiting one's turn. It's all too easy to write off those with whom we disagree as being merely malicious, thereby releasing us from the wearying task of actually considering and refuting the substance of their arguments. In the family, we rarely have that luxury. Or if we attempt to ignore someone else's point of view, we'll generally get a rude awakening as to the fact. I can't help wondering whether the progressive decline in family structures and a coherent family life has contributed to an increasingly intemperate nature of political debate and public discourse, particularly in relation to online media. Individuals and families have so many calls on their time these days that they have less and less time to spend together and learn from each other. It seems to me that many of us have either forgotten or perhaps were never taught how to disagree politely or respectfully with each other. And this is a development, I think, which is greatly to be regretted, because a healthy and functioning democracy requires that ideas be debated as to their substance and merit without necessarily imputing malice to the person who's saying it. Children can't learn this unless they're taught it. They can't absorb it unless they are given good example. It's interesting to remind ourselves of what the Church has to say on the matter of parents' duties to children. The Catechism states that by its very nature, the institution of marriage and married love is ordered to the procreation and education of the offspring, and it is in them that it finds its crowning glory. And in a reminder to parents of what can only be called an awesome duty, it states, "Parents are the principal and first educators of their children. In this sense, the fundamental task of marriage and family is to be at the service of life." The Catechism also reminds us that Christ chose to be born and grow up in the bosom of the Holy Family of Joseph and Mary. The Church is nothing other than the family of God. It calls the human family the Ecclesia Domestica, or domestic church, and says that it is in the family that parents are, by word and example, the first heralds of the faith with regard to their children. Thus, the home is the first school of Christian life and a school for human enrichment. Here one learns endurance and the joy of work, fraternal love, generous, even repeated forgiveness, and above all, divine worship in prayer and the offering of one's life. That really puts it up to those of us who have children. It's also a reminder that things like generosity and forgiveness can really only be learned when living in close proximity to others, the environment that is the family. The ties of family, our duty to love each other, remind us that despite our disagreements, we're all in this together, that we must do our best to coexist in peace. And if that lesson in all its simplicity and profundity could be better and more widely learned, then we'd have a much better society than we do. I have suggested that one of the greatest strengths of the family is that we have no choice about it. It is perhaps unsurprising then that the most immediate and pressing threat to the family derives from an ideology that holds choice out as a supreme good. The greatest threat to family in Ireland at the moment is the movement to repeal the Eighth Amendment. Contrary to what people think, including our Taoiseach and politicians it would seem, the Eighth Amendment is actually not a constitutional ban on abortion. Rather, it recognises the right to life of the child before birth. Beneath the framework of the Constitution sits the legislation, and it's legislation in this country that bans abortion. Because, of course, it follows that if a child has a constitutional right to life before birth, then that child also has a right not to be subjected to an unjust attack or to be killed. The recent Citizens' Assembly voted to remove this recognition from the Constitution and to replace it with a provision giving the Oireachtas power to decide on whether the rights of children before birth are to be recognised at all. If this were to happen, there would be nothing to stop our politicians from deciding whatever they liked. And it is sad to say that given that there is not one party in the Dáil that supports the retention of the Eighth Amendment, it is unlikely that what they would choose would protect children in the womb. Those who wish to see the Eighth Amendment repealed want to take away children's rights before they're born. Most people can see that this is an attack on infants and their rights, but I want to look at its effect on the family. Abortion attacks family at its roots. It undermines the relationships of mother and baby, father and baby, mother and father. It pits mothers against their children, and in calling pregnancy a violation of a woman's bodily integrity, turns babies into aggressors. Fathers are reduced to being the men that put pressure on women to abort, or else become helpless bystanders, powerless in a society that elevates choice over justice. Siblings are hurt by abortion and really have no voice, often constrained and confused by a sense of loyalty to their mother or sister, as the case may be. but hurting inside at the loss of a younger brother or sister and having no way to express it. Abortion hurts everyone. It hurts whole families. It leaves scars. By contrast, there is beauty in the birth of a child, no matter whether rich or poor, sick or healthy. Where is the beauty in an abortion? There is no beauty. There is no hope. There is no second chance, no undoing of what has been done. Only empty finality. And that is why so many women in this country suffer in silence after their abortion. A society with legalized abortion sends out a message to women that their babies are dispensable. It encourages people to screen out those who are seen as less than perfect of the next generation, their own flesh and blood, because their bodies don't look right or their brains don't function normally. It rejects the ties of duty and unconditional love. A society with legalized abortion allows a child to be punished for the criminal acts of her father, even though she, like her mother, is a hapless victim. A society with legalized abortion allows a child whose natural life doctors guess at might be short to be put to death despite the fact that it is the only life that baby will ever have. Why should the length of one's life become the determining factor of whether the state should protect you from unjust attack? Why should illness or disability be the determining factor in whether someone gets to live or die? Who gets to make these decisions about whether someone has an adequate quality of life? Can't we see that that's a dangerous proposition? That some people get to choose whether other people's lives are worth living? For Christians, this is the opposite of Christ's example. He thought that every human being ever created, no matter whether rich or poor, healthy or sick, innocent or guilty, was worth loving, even to the point of dying for us on the cross so that we might live. While abortion hurts real people, it's also a terrible attack on the idea of motherhood and fatherhood in our society too. And ideas are important. Our ideas about family, for instance, whether we regard the ties of duty and love as being important, shape our attitudes and behaviour in our families. To a pro-choice mindset, not being able to avail of an abortion or reproductive health services, as it is euphemistically called, is seen as being a threat to a woman's independence and chance for happiness in life. As we know, the vast majority of abortions are for social reasons, finances, relationship reasons, work and lifestyle. In this context, abortion is portrayed as being a ticket to freedom. If we can park the issue of whether that is true or not for a minute, I want to look at what that attitude, as repeated ad nauseum through various media channels, does to the idea of parenthood and motherhood in particular. If motherhood is portrayed as an encumbrance and pregnancy an infliction, what kind of message does that send out to young women? It tells them, in a not so subtle way, that having a baby is a bad thing because it makes you weak and vulnerable and that your life as you know it is over. It tells young women that their fertility is something to be feared, managed and controlled by medication. And it says that if you become pregnant at a time before you're ready, that you should take care of it because every baby should be a wanted baby. This language that is used about being wanted means that a person's worth is reduced to what someone else thinks of them or the degree to which they matter to someone else. This is the opposite of unconditional love, which is at the heart of what it means to be family. The truth is, everyone is wanted by someone. But even more importantly, everyone has a right to live the life they have been given. Abortion robs women and men of the joy of the love of their own child, the joy of unconditional love and self-giving that is the stuff of parenthood. And this is true whether a baby is placed for adoption or is raised by his or her own parents. How many of you who are parents would swap your place with someone without children? And I'm not talking just for a nice weekend away or a holiday. I mean forever. Becoming a parent changes you. Seeing your baby for the first time, holding and getting to know him or her, it changes you. Women are taught to fear this change, that their lives will be changed forever. It is true that life will never be the same again once a baby is born, but that doesn't have to be a bad thing. That's not the full story. How many people do you know who regret having their baby? How many do you know who, despite difficult circumstances, had their baby and for whom that child is now the apple of their eye? I know lots, and I'm sure you do too. Life is forever changed after an abortion too. Women pay a high price for this kind of freedom. Many women find themselves distressed and grieving years after their abortion, and it's the kind of grief that career, success, or money, or even relationships don't cure. But that's not something that's often spoken about. And it's not just the mother that's affected. The path of history is changed forever. I was recently approached after a talk I was giving by a woman who began to tell me a story, and she became quite emotional, but reassured me it was a good story. She reminisced that when she was living in London 40 years ago as a student teacher, she and her flatmate hid 2 girls who were pregnant. They fed them and kept them and supported them in having their babies when no one else would. One girl had come to her and said that her mother was putting her under pressure to have an abortion. This lady prayed with her and told her to wait 9 days before going back to her mother. She waited and went back, and when she went back, her mother was supportive. The girl went on to have her baby, a little girl, who's now grown up and has 2 children of her own. So, said the lady who told me all of this, abortion doesn't just kill the child, one child, but future generations too. Those 2 children would never have been born had their mother been aborted in the womb. Abortion takes its toll on families, but it also destroys the possibility of future generations being born because one child dies. How different might life be if children were given their chance to live? And that's the question that we as Catholics should ask, and indeed the hope that we should present to women who find themselves pregnant in difficult circumstances. We need to ask ourselves, which is the more loving thing to do? To say to a woman who's in a difficult position, go and have an abortion, I support you, it'll all be fine, and then leave her to her own devices. Or to say to her, it's okay, pregnancy is not the worst thing that can happen to you. Have your baby, I'll help you. You'll be a great mother. Sometimes we need encouragement like that, to hear words like that. You'll be a great mother. You'll be so proud of your child one day, and you'll be proud of yourself for what you've done in giving your child life. He or she will bring so much joy to your life. And if you don't feel that you're able to raise the baby, there's always adoption. I'll be there for you. And then when the baby is born, you see the mother smile as she gazes into her baby's eyes. You see her kiss and cuddle her baby. And even if she's still sad or uncertain about how their life may pan out, there is joy and solace in the baby's very presence. This is the true joy of family, founded on unconditional love. As we prepare for the World Meeting of Families, let us appreciate the challenges that face us and engage with the culture around us. Although it doesn't know it, that culture is starved of joy. The gospel is indeed good news, but it requires ordinary Catholics like us to remove the bushel and to place the light in its rightful place where it can be seen. Let us bear witness to Christ's command to love one another as he loved us. Let us reveal to the world the great secret about the family, that being faithful to our duty to love, we discover joy.